Hi, welcome to this chat about how to drive down your energy costs. Now, we've got a slightly unusual situation, quite a different relationship with our home, I suppose, as one way of describing this. So, we've been in the same house for 30 years. And when we moved there 30 years ago, it was very much an interim move. The property market was crazy, prices were going up enormously, very quickly. We were renting and we needed to get back on the house market quickly. Couldn't find what we wanted, bought this with the intention of looking around to find something we liked. And we've been looking around ever since. And in many ways, the house has served us well. But because we were always planning to move, making long-term investments in things like solar and the things we'll be talking about here become problematic. Because if you're planning to move the following year or 2 years, the return on investment becomes the driver. And so you need to be cautious with what you spend your money on. And as it happens, that turns out to have been quite a good strategy because a number of technologies and things have come together in that time, and we have benefited from not spending vast sums of money on it by just being a little bit cautious. Now, I design buildings for a living, so I have a certain amount of professional knowledge on this, but the majority of what I'm talking about here really comes from our personal experience. And what I should say at the outset is everyone's situation is different. There are very few of us that are in exactly the same position as far as our house is concerned, the orientation of the house, our circumstances, and so on. So this is very much unique to us, but I'm hopeful that there are messages in here that everyone can benefit from. So let's go. And the first thing to consider in this is the 5 technologies that the government here in the UK is giving us funding for as grants or loans or whatever. And those are solar PV, domestic batteries, boiler upgrades, transition to EV, and thermal performance upgrades. Now, what I have come to find is that one of those is probably pretty much a waste of money. And another one is pretty much the driver of all the others. And those two are a surprise. They were certainly a surprise to me. So I'd expect it to be a surprise to most people as to which is the most important thing to do and which is the least important thing to do. So before I get into that in detail, what I want to do is quickly cover what the general view is on these and what my view was until I reached the point that we're at now. So let's look at solar to start with. So this is the perceived view on solar PV. So I'm only really talking about solar PV, so the generation of electricity via solar panels. So solar PV has a number of benefits, and those benefits are it's clean energy and it's free energy, completely free. So massive. But there are also a few negatives that we need to take into account with this, and those are timings. So, the sun is only out during certain periods of the day, and it peaks in the middle of the day. And generally speaking, the bulk of it comes at a time when most of us are likely to be at work or at school or uni or whatever we're doing. So the timings are a bit of a problem. They can be unsightly. I think this image here is a good example of that. They're not always pretty. We have to have the right roof surfaces, and we have to have a roof. Many people are in rented accommodation or in a tower block or whatever. They're also quite costly to install, which results in a fairly long return on investment. Now let's look at the time of day issue as an example. So this is a chart showing the solar we generated from our solar panels a couple of weeks ago. And this is our usage on that same day. And you see the problem. If I overlay both of those, you can see that the green bit, the sunny bit, is generally wasted. The bulk of it is wasted. And most of our usage is outside of that period. And for that reason, a really important tool is the battery. And what a battery is in this instance is just a time offset, a time shift device. It consumes the electricity and stores the electricity that came during the day from the solar and enables you to use it in the evening and possibly the following morning. So it's a time shift device. Very useful. And the other limitation with solar is the time of year. This chart shows our generation over a 12-month period, and the green area shows our usage over that same period. And you'll see we're well short of covering our needs, especially at the winter. Now, the typical solution to this is to provide more solar panels, and you end up with a chart that looks something like this. So this is 4 times more solar panels than I currently have. And you can see that you still have these areas in the winter where it is inadequate. It isn't providing enough. And we have considerably more than we need in the summer. Now, the problem with that is nowadays, the DNOs, the network operators, are limiting the size of inverter that they will allow on the system, because too much solar going in when the sun suddenly comes out can cause them massive problems. So they're limiting it, which means we may not be able to sell that electricity to them, which means it all goes to waste, or a large part of it goes to waste. And then we've got the problems in the winter where we're not getting enough of it. So solar is great for it being free and for it being completely clean, or fairly clean. But we have these problems with time shift and timings. So what about an air source heat pump upgrade? So this is where the government is giving a bus grant for one of these. Now, the benefits of an air source heat pump are, again, it's clean energy. And they have a COP of 400%. COP meaning coefficient of performance. So if you put 1 kilowatt of electricity into one, you get potentially 4 kilowatts of heat out of it. And this is incredible. You know, this is almost mind-blowing. This is like no other heating system we've ever heard of before. I say, absolutely mind-blowing. On the negative side, electricity is 4 times more costly than gas and oil, typically. And so it negates that benefit. You know, we're not seeing that benefit because of the cost of electricity. So that's a bit of a problem. The other problem is they're least effective when they're needed most. So the time we need them most, the external air temperature is the lowest it will be. Tricky. And the other issue is they don't match well to our existing heating system. So our existing heating systems are designed with a flow temperature of around about 60 degrees C, and these run at about 30 degrees C. So that it's a completely different design profile as far as the system downstream of the heater is concerned. They also can be very costly to install. Because of the issue I've just mentioned, we're often told that we have to replace radiators, replace the pipes, replace the hot water cylinder, and that results in a particularly long return on investment. And there may not be any return on investment at all. If it's costing the same as the boiler that came out, you may never see a return on that investment. So the next thing is an EV upgrade. What does that look like? Well, the benefits: clean energy, again, very cheap motoring, great performance and comfort. There's actually quite a pile of benefits, I think, with an EV. I'm just going to stick with those. On the negative side, you've got to have a driveway. You know, you need to be able to charge at home. You need some way of charging at home. Although I do know someone who doesn't and has done very well with it, but there you go. And also the upcost of the car and the charger is generally higher than petrol or diesel cars. So what about thermal performance? Improving the thermal performance of your house. Well, this has been really the theme of my career. You know, I was trained back in the late 1970s, just after probably the first big fuel crisis. And so really from that point onwards, we've been taking what we call a fabric first approach, where we try and get the fabric of the building, the envelope of the building right thermally, and that solves all sorts of problems as far as heating and all the rest of it is concerned. As a retrofit, adding insulation to your existing buildings, it's a different situation. So the first thing is the benefits. It conserves energy. On the negative side, it's really costly to do. It has a negative impact generally on the inhabitants in the building, and it generally has a negative impact on the health of the building itself. Also, there's a very long return on investment. These things are really, really expensive to do generally, so massive return on investment. So let's dig a little bit deeper into some of those issues. So If you're applying an external wall insulation, and what I should do is qualify this and saying, I'm only talking about wall insulation here. Loft insulation, well, any form of insulation comes with potential issues, but they're easier to deal with in certain parts of the building. So within the loft of a building, if you're putting it at ceiling level, you can easily ventilate above it, which is what's necessary. You need to get air above to remove any moisture and stop any interstitial condensation within the loft space. I'll explain interstitial condensation in a minute. Wall insulation, if we're putting it on the outside of the building, is much more problematic. The first thing is insulation needs to be contiguous. In other words, it needs to be joined up all the way around the building. Any gaps create what we call a cold bridge. And what a cold bridge does is it attracts moisture, or moisture forms there. So the warm air within the building can contain quite significant amounts of water vapor. If that condenses on a much cooler surface, you'll get moisture buildup and then you'll get mold. Now, if you take these points here up in the eaves of the building, that's pretty much the worst place. So it's almost impossible to link the insulation in the roof to the insulation on the outside of the wall. Up there, you'll get the warmest, most moist air in the building, and the air the other side of it on the outside is likely to be the coolest around the building, where the air moves quite quickly across that part of the building. So at that point, you are likely to get mold growth. This is often made worse by these rooms normally being bedrooms, and you quite often got wardrobes and things there, so you're not actually getting any airflow internally. Massive problems in that situation. You also get problems at your window and door openings, where you get a cold bridge there, where it's almost impossible to avoid that situation. And again, with a connection down there with the floor. Now, the other thing to look at here is the temperature curve as we go across the wall. We've got 20 degrees inside, say, and 0 degrees outside, or whatever that might be. 20 degrees, air at 20 degrees can hold an awful lot of moisture. At 0 degrees, very little. And so at some point, the moisture will drop out of the air as it passes across the wall of the building. The point at which it drops out is what we call the dew point, and that's typically around about 5 degrees C. So if you look at this temperature curve, the 5 degrees C point is probably somewhere on the interface between the insulation and the wall, or within the insulation. Either way, it will dramatically reduce the performance of the insulation, and it will be damaging to the fabric of the building. So these are all issues associated with adding external wall insulation to your building. If you go for internal wall insulation, and I feel this is slightly the wrong term, I think it should be internal external wall insulation, because we're adding internal insulation to the external wall. So internal external wall insulation. We solve many of those cold bridging and interstitial condensation issues by putting the insulation on the inside of the building. We still have them, typically, as we've shown here, at floor level. And at every point, an internal structure hits the external wall of the building. So that's when any internal wall hits there, when the floor hits there. If you're in a joined up situation where you're joined to another property, at the party wall between the two of those, any of those situations, you will get a cold bridge. You also get cold bridges at all the openings, windows and doors. Now, you can solve the windows and doors ones by taking out your windows and doors, wrapping the insulation into that reveal, and then put smaller windows and doors in, which isn't ideal and adds more to the cost. And when I mention cost, internal, external wall insulation is massively costly. It is incredibly disruptive. Almost everything has to come out of the building. So your kitchen units, your sanitary ware, toilets, floor finishes, architrave skirtings, electrical power points on those walls, radiators, plumbing, wall, window boards, almost everything has to change. So it becomes an incredibly expensive thing to do. So it's the safer form of external wall insulation, but it's by far the most costly. If we look at how we handle modern buildings, so new build, this is really interesting because it's much easier to make the insulation contiguous, but it's still hard work. It's one of the hardest things I do, the amount of work you put into making sure that you're not going to create problems for that building. And we still have many buildings with those problems. I think it's one of the largest warranty issues for new build houses is interstitial condensation, causing damage to the fabric of the building. I was looking at one just up the road from us only a couple of weeks ago, built 3 years ago on a housing estate, and the moisture buildup in the roof space was staggering. And that's not going to last long. That roof will not last long in that situation, in those circumstances. So we were looking at ways of how we can address this. In this particular instance, it was a problematic one because the building was very narrow. It was in a row of buildings. It was 3 stories high, so there was collecting a lot of moisture through the building. It was ending up at the top of the building. And because it was very narrow, it was very deep front to back. So getting a good airflow across it was really quite difficult. And we just have set rules for what the airflow should be without really considering what those different situations are. And the people that designed this one hadn't really taken on board what these issues would be. Anyway, we'll get there with that one. So it's a problem. The more we insulate, the more we get, or the greater the amount of insulation we use, the more this is a problem. Now, with modern buildings, we also make them airtight, or pretty much airtight, which is intriguing. But it's intriguing because the one thing we, as humans, need more than anything is fresh air. And we need about half a litre roughly every 3 seconds from the moment we're born to the moment we die. Okay, and that's non-negotiable. We have to have fresh air. And we exhale, of course, air that isn't good for us. So we need to be able to get rid of that and get in fresh air. And so sealing up a building to this extent seems crazy, to be honest. Now, I appreciate that under the building regulations, they do then make provision for ventilation. But the whole thing seems a little bit bizarre, especially as for most of us, when we're designing buildings, the solution to this problem is to put more kit in, to put in another piece of equipment. And that piece of equipment is typically a mechanical ventilation system with heat recovery. So effectively bringing in air from the outside, taking out the air from the inside, passing it over a heat exchanger so that we can take the heat out of the outgoing and put it into the ingoing so that we're not wasting too much of our heat. And again, this seems like one of those classic human being solutions where we create problems for ourselves and then we have to create a machine to overcome that problem. And if you take the situation where that building is sat in fresh air that's 62 miles high, and look at all the technology that is going into it to give us fresh air, when all you've got to do is step outside or just open a window, it seems completely insane. But that's where we are with new buildings, because of our demand to insulate. So why are we insulating? What is the purpose behind all the insulation and the airtightness? Well, it's simple. It's one thing only, to conserve fuel. Okay. So then you need to ask, why are we conserving fuel? Well, that's not quite so simple. There's 3 principal reasons for this. The first is that the fuel we use is finite. It will one day run out. It's also polluting. It kills us. I think last year something like, it was 40 million people across the planet were killed because of air quality problems. I think there was 2 million people died last year because of climate change related issues. And this is us doing this. We are killing people by the choices we make day in, day out. We are choosing to kill our fellow human beings. So the fuel is polluting. We don't want to pump too much of it out there. It's also costly. So those are the 3 principal reasons why we have to conserve it. There's another one that came to mind the other day with the situation that's going on at the moment. When the early days of humans, we used to use food and water as a tool of warfare. We would lay siege to cities and towns and restrict the supply of water and food so that the people would eventually starve and give up, and then the war was won. Well, in the 20th century, right through to now, the shift has been to control fossil fuels and use those as a tool of war. And we're seeing this at the moment with all that our dear friend Mr. Trump is doing. And so we need to conserve fuel because it's finite, it's polluting, it's costly, and it's being weaponized. So those are the reasons. So What if we go to an energy source that's infinite, an energy source that is clean, an energy source that is affordable, and an energy source that is local? What if we did that? Would we still need to make our buildings unhealthy? Would we still need to try and conserve it? I would say no. Now, clean electricity, in the words of the great man himself, clean electricity delivers 2 out of 3, which ain't bad. Or 3 out of 4 if you count the local aspect. So clean electricity is infinite and clean, as the name suggests. What we need to do is make it affordable. It's also local, so it solves the warringers of this world. So this is what this talk is about, is how we can make our energy source affordable. Now, we can complain as much as we like to the government about the policies we have, which is making it so expensive. But actually, it's something we can take control of, which is what I'm talking about here. Here we go. So how do we make it affordable? Well, the obvious thing is solar PV, because it's free. If you put solar panels on your roof, it gives you free electricity. And obviously it's clean as well. But as we said earlier, there's a problem with this. And you can overcome that problem by using a battery in the summer, but it doesn't solve the problem in the winter because you don't get enough solar to fully charge the battery for the amount of electricity you need in the winter. So what if you invert that relationship between the two and say, what if we make this a battery-led solution? What if we design the battery to power the house? Now that becomes really interesting if you happen to have an EV and if you're on an EV tariff. And there are other tariffs that do similar things just for battery owners. But the EV one delivers the cheapest electricity at night. Should probably be called a domestic battery tariff. Now, if we look at this chart here, the red zone there is representing how much we pay for our electricity during daytime, during peak electricity. So for me, it's typically 27p a kilowatt hour. At night time, because of our EV tariff, we're paying typically about 6 to 7p a kilowatt hour. So the solar panel will save us 27p per kilowatt hour when we're getting free electricity from it. The battery will save us 21p, so it will take us all the way down there to that 6p. So it saves us all but that last 6p. But the thing with the battery is it does that every single day, all year, no matter what the weather. And I think that might make it more cost effective than the solar panel. The other thing with the battery is it's relatively easy to take it with you when you move. And we're still thinking of moving. So you can just pack it up, get an electrician to disconnect it, take it to your new home and plug it in. I can see people in the future having a battery that they take with them for their lives, a battery for life. And, you know, some people have talked about battery degradation. And yes, there is some battery degradation over time. Nowhere near as much as there used to be. And actually, as the new technologies are coming in, so sodium ion, for example, there's apparently no degradation with those batteries. Well, if you're investing in a battery, go for a sodium ion battery, I would say, for your home. By far the best way forward. So the battery could actually work out more cost effective over a year than the solar panels, if you've got an EV and if you've got an EV tariff. Now, to make that work, you need to have a big enough battery. So make sure your sizing is correct. You also need a big enough inverter. And a bit, as I said earlier with solar, is that may be a problem in that the DNOs are often restricting the size of inverter we can use. So with a battery, you can overcome that problem by stacking them up, by effectively using more than one battery and more than one inverter. It becomes a battery of batteries. You know, the misuse of the word battery has become a problem here. But anyway, we can still call them batteries and we can still call them inverters, and a pair of both may just be a good way to go to get you what you need. The other thing to do, if you want green electricity, is just go to a green supplier. You know, let the supplier take the heat rather than you putting in lots and lots of solar panels. Just put enough, you know, right size your solar array. Just put enough in and then let your green supplier supply the bulk of our green electricity. They're really good at it. They're doing it en masse. They're doing it with wind farms, with solar, with waves, with rivers, with all sorts. There's so many ways you can generate electricity. It's one of the things that makes it the great fuel going forwards, is the number of ways in which it can be generated. Now, these are the 4 top green suppliers, according to which this year, 2026. I've used 2 of them. I've used Octopus and I've used Ecotricity, both amazing companies. I don't know the other 2 at all, I'm sorry. They may be equally amazing. Now, I started off with Ecotricity when we first started off on this journey, and I moved to Octopus purely because of their EV tariff, which was at that time untouchable. I think it probably is. So that's what we did. We then, in 2021, we decided to replace our internal combustion engine car with an EV, which was quite an interesting journey in itself. I don't mean the journey in the car, but that process, because we were doing this purely for cost reasons and for environmental impact reasons. And we do most of our travelling very local. And so I thought I could easily handle an EV because, most of our projects are within 30 miles of the office. Didn't even test one, didn't even try one. In fact, one of the jokes is that when it finally arrived, I think it was on a 3-month order or something like that. When it finally arrived and I drove it up the road, I was driving like I did when I was 16 years old. I was kangarooing up the road. I had no idea of the acceleration and the engine braking and what impact that would have. So, and I had to stop and just recalibrate. And I thought I could drive, and I was all over the shop. But the interesting thing is, having bought the EV for one reason, I very quickly realised that this was so much better than any other car I've ever had, that we would never drive the petrol car that we'd hung on to. And so we sold the petrol car. And interestingly, after just 2 weeks with the EV, we decided to drive up to Scotland for a holiday. And it handled it beautifully. These people that say you can't go anywhere with them, you need to think again. And we can cover that on another video, exactly how you do that. So then we decided to get in the solar and the battery. And this didn't go well. It didn't go well because I had a pretty good idea of the solar array I wanted and the battery size I wanted. And when you're talking to experts, and I had 3 or 4 of them come in, they were all saying something different to what I was saying. And when they're experts, you think, okay, they know what they're talking about. So I felt I needed to follow their guidance to some extent. I did stick with it as far as the solar array is concerned. We put in a modest solar array. The battery is twice the size they were suggesting I should have, but it was half the size I wanted. I wanted a 24 kilowatt hour battery, and we ended up with a 12 kilowatt hour battery. And we'll see as we go through this how that panned out. And then I installed an all-electric heating system. Now, again, this didn't go as we had planned. There's a theme here. So it didn't go as I'd intended. I'd intended to put in an air source heat pump. And my belief was the ultimate heating system was an air source heat pump hybrid with infrared, far infrared panels. So I have been using infrared panels for a few years at that point. We put them in quite a lot of historic buildings, listed buildings, where putting in a central heating system was problematic because of the damage it does to the fabric, number of holes you've got to drill and all that sort of thing. And also infrared is really good for the fabric of the building. It's a very good way of keeping it dry, for one thing. If you've got older buildings that haven't got damp proofing solutions, it's a really good solution. So we had done a lot of infrared, including at our own office. So we've got to know it quite well. My view was, if you've got a heating system that has infrared heating panels that effectively function at the transition months of the winter, so the start of the winter and the end of the winter, if you use your infrared at that point, I can see days when you only want a little bit of heat in the living room. The living room is the room you need most heat because it's the only room in the house normally where you are completely static. Apart from the bedroom but in the bedroom you've got a quilt over you. But in the living room, at the end of the day, you normally sit down and listen to music or watch TV or play games. Those are the things we do in our living room. And it's the only place where we sit still. And that's why that room needs to be warmer than any others. So there are times when you just need a bit of heat in the living room at the very start of the winter and very end of the winter. Infrared's perfect for that. And slowly you can grow that through the house to deliver what you want at those transition months or weeks. And then, because an air source heat pump is happiest if it's just ticking over, you can bring in the infrared heat to give you extra heat on the coldest days of the winter. So that was my plan. My plan was a hybrid solution, but I could get none of the installers I spoke to do it. They all said that to get the bus grant, the air source heat pump had to be the primary heat source. And it was going to be the primary heat source. It was just being supported by infrared. That still made it primary. Just as if you've got a wood-burning stove in your house, your air source heat pump is still your primary heat source. So all the people I spoke to said, no, we can't get the bus grant because it's not your primary heat source. So I put in infrared myself. I bought the infrared from a company called Herschel down in Bristol. Brilliant company. If you're from this conversation, if you're interested in pursuing infrared, speak to Herschel. Strongly recommended. So we went infrared everywhere. And this is our energy costs for 2025, for last year. So at this point, we've had the infrared, I think, in for 2, maybe 3 winters. So we're pretty up to speed with it. We're very happy with it. It's awesome. If you look at the headline figure there at the end of the year, our total electricity cost was £2,286.44p. Now, you may say to me, Gary, that's a lot of money. My wife did when we've got our first electric bill in the winter, because all of a sudden everything is going onto your electric bill. You know, your heating costs, your motoring costs, as well as your domestic electric. Everything is going onto that one bill. So that one bill gets a lot higher. Obviously, you lose all of the others, but your electric bill gets very high. Now, one of the things that's interesting about this bill and the way, and because I've broken it out, and this is the reason why I've broken it out like this, is to look at the difference between the peak electricity cost and the off-peak, or the peak usage and the off-peak usage. And what I wanted with my batteries is to have about 80% off-peak and 20% peak in the winter. And then I know I've got the battery about right. And you can see I'm nowhere near that. Absolutely nowhere near that. So the battery is not delivering what I wanted it to do. And so really, I've been trying to persuade my lovely wife, long-suffering wife, that I need more batteries, or that we need more batteries. Before we get on to that, let's just have a look at what those 2025 costs would have been had we not made the changes. So this area in the blue here is basically looking at the fuels that we used prior to doing the transition, and then applying to them the 2025 costs of those fuels. So for example, with the electricity, the usage in kilowatt hours is exactly what we used before we transitioned, but the cost is related to 2025 costs. Same with the car, that's based on the mileage we used to do and based on the car used to do up to about 50 miles per gallon. I've based it on 50 miles per gallon. I've tried to be generous, so it probably costs more than that, but 2,120 for the petrol for the car. Now, I haven't included any servicing costs or any consumables costs, both of which are far higher than they are for an EV. So the costs of that would have been greater, but I'm just looking at fuel here. So just the fuel that goes in the car. And then we got the fuel that went into the boiler. Now, our boiler was an oil boiler. We live out in a rural location. So 2025 oil and gas were about the same, okay? Because of the warring problems we've been experiencing, the cost of the two are about the same. But normally oil is more expensive. But at this point in time, they were both about the same. So I'd expect gas to look the same as this. Now, interesting thing is just looking at the cost of the car, which isn't far off the total cost of what our electricity is now. And the heating oil is half what our total cost is now, covering the car, the house, and everything, and all the heating. The infrared heating, I did a calculation and separated out as best I can, because it's difficult to separate out these things. But as best I could, I separated out the cost of the infrared heating, and I think it was about half, close on half, maybe not quite half, but about half what the oil heating was. So, I was very happy with that, really happy with the infrared. It was delivering well. Now, on the right-hand side, on the green column, I've got 2026 costs. So that's taking those same elements, the cost of the car, the cost of the heating, and the cost of the electric, and applying 2026 rates to all three of those. So at 2026 rates, our total bill would have been £5,308. So our savings are pretty significant here. So we're happy people. One figure to take with you as we go on to the next slide is the average cost per day in January on our 2025 figures, which is £22.90. So our average cost of fuel, and we'll reference this a little bit as we go forward. So here we are, January 2025. And this is one of our bills. This is a bill for that day, the 1st of January 2025. And I've picked this day for a good reason, which I will mention in a minute. Now, our costs for the day, including standing charge and VAT, is £7.64. So considerably less than the £22.90 we were paying the year before. But this chart, this bill hasn't been put up there for that reason specifically. It's been put on to illustrate the problem with my battery. If you look at the graph at the top, that's looking at energy use per half hour through the day, starting at midnight, finishing at midnight. And you can see the red line is actually the tariff, or the amount we're paying for our electricity. So through the night until 5:30 in the morning, it's just under 7p. Then it jumps up to 27p through the day, and then it drops down again at 11:30 to just under 7p. So you can see through the night, it's charging our domestic battery. And that's why there's quite a lot of electricity use. Then it drops down and there's hardly any electric use. And that's because the battery is providing the energy at that point. It peaks then just after lunch. And that's obviously where we put an oven on, or cooking in general, may have been dishwasher as well, that sort of thing. And that peak is caused by the electric current being drawn being greater than our inverter can provide. The inverter is the thing that takes, the principle, what an inverter does properly is it converts DC current into AC. But the inverters we use for these sorts of systems also charge the battery from the solar. They charge the battery from the grid. They also enable us to put electricity back into the grid. So it's a hybrid device that's more than just an inverter, but we call them an inverter. So just at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, we've obviously cooked supper and cleaned up afterwards. And so there's more electricity being used than our 5 kilowatt inverter can provide. So that's why there's that little peak. And then just after that, the battery goes flat. And from the rest of the day, we're using electricity straight off the grid. So this is my issue. The battery isn't big enough. But that day, the 1st of January, is a day when we use very little electricity because we work from home. And on the 1st of January, we're not working. Okay, sorry, customers, but we don't. Okay, so it's a quiet day at home. There was also no charging of the car. So that's as cheap as it comes. Okay, that's as good as it gets as far as my battery is concerned. Now, if we go forward, forward 4 days to the 5th of January, we've got a completely different profile. So what's happening here in that first section where the bars go really high, they're going up to about 5 kilowatt. That's when we're charging the car and the home battery. So the home battery and car are being charged at the same time. Then we drop down to almost nothing. That's when the battery is delivering its business. And then you see by about 9 o'clock, the battery is flat. And so for the rest of the day, we're consuming far more electricity, consuming electricity at a rate I'm not comfortable with. And you can see this in the cost figures here. But look at this. So if we take that January the 5th invoice forward and compare it to this one on the 18th, something very, very funny is happening. The total amount of electricity consumed is about the same. So on the 5th of January, it's 96 kilowatt hours. That's a lot for a day, but that's because we're charging the car. On the 18th of January, we're also charging the car. We used 2 kilowatt hours more electricity on the 18th of January. But look at the cost. On the 5th is £16.80. On the 18th is £7.21. What's going on? Now, I didn't know about this at the time. I've only just found this invoice when I've been putting this talk together. What I didn't know, because being a boy, I'm not very good at reading the instructions and the rules and all that sort of thing. What I didn't know was what Plus Energy do is they give you the 6 hours at night on the low tariff, but if you plug your EV in during the day, when the electricity supply drops to values that enable them to, they charge you that 6 to 7p during the day. So what I'm meaning by that is if there's times during the day when the solar on the system is doing its business and when the wind turbines are doing their business, which drops the cost of electricity enormously, they then sell it at this reduced rate if you plug your car in order to enable you to charge your car during the day, which can be very useful for some people. Now, I didn't know anything about this. The first I knew about it was when they sent me an email, but I'll talk about that a little bit further on. The other thing that happened in January of this year is I came across a video by the Heat Geeks. Now, the Heat Geeks have got quite a strong YouTube presence, and they're one of two companies that I trust for getting up-to-date information on air source heat pumps. There are two companies that I think really know what they're talking about. There's a lot that don't, okay? But there's two that really know what they're talking about. There's the Heat Geeks, and there's a guy called John Cantor. Both of those are awesome. There are others that I'm sure are good, but I've only come across these two that really know what they're talking about. Heat Geeks launched something late last year that they called Zero Disrupt. Now, putting in an air source heat pump is going to cause a certain amount of disruption no matter what. But Zero Disrupt, the policy is you take out your existing boiler, you put in an air source heat pump, you do nothing else. You don't replace the radiators, you don't replace the pipework, you don't replace the hot water cylinder, you don't demand a load of insulation be put on the walls or floors or whatever. Zero Disrupt. Now, this sounds crazy to me because of all the problems we all knew about air source heat pumps as a retrofit device, as a replacement for an existing boiler. They don't fit. It's not a perfect match. So I dug into it, I listened to some of their talks and all the rest of it. And what they were saying was that after being involved with some 800 installs, and they're not all their installs, quite a lot of these are where they've gone in and sorted out other people's installs and got them working properly, and then analysing the data, because Adam, who started Heat Geeks, his current business partner, is an IT specialist and a data analyst specialist. He's basically digging into all of this and saying, hold on, we're missing something here. And what they found was, if you do it properly, if you know what you're doing, if you set the system up correctly, it will work with your existing kit. And I thought, brilliant, that's exactly what I want to hear. Exactly what I want to hear. And the problem I had was my infrared heating system was lovely. No problem with it at all. But I knew I wouldn't be able to sell the house. And we've been wanting to sell it for 30 years. So all of a sudden, I've got something here that enables me to take out my infrared. Sorry, not take out my infrared. It will enable me to put in something that other people would recognise. Because if they recognise the infrared heating, they wouldn't recognise how I'm controlling it. Because that's something I've written myself. And it's, you really need to understand my mind to understand how this stuff works. And no one can do that. So what we did was immediately I booked a consultation, which means you've got to pay, I think, £250 or something like that. And my local Heat Geek, because the Heat Geeks are a franchise, and what the Heat Geeks principally do is they train heating engineers how to install heat pumps properly, okay? How to do it well. And my local Heat Geek was a guy called Ben, and Ben came around, he did a survey, he sat with me, he explained it all, and I love it when you're in the room with someone who knows more about this stuff than you do. And I've often been in this situation on this journey when I'm in the room with people that don't know about this stuff as much as I do. And that's always worrying because I don't know that much, okay? But Ben knew what he was talking about. He'd measured it all up. He'd calculated the heat losses of the building, which exactly matched my figures because I knew exactly how the building was built. So my figures were pretty accurate and his exactly matched that without me having to tell him anything. So I was very impressed with that. And he sat down and he explained that, yes, they can do a Zero Disrupt install. And he said the only thing is the price is going to be different to the $2,400 that I've been quoted online, which to me was mind-blowingly cheap. And I'm thinking, that will do me. So, okay, it's going to be different. What is it? £1,200. So by the time you've taken the grant out of it, the bus grant, it was £1,200. £200 to put in an air source heat pump. That was an absolute no-brainer. I can tell you, I was signing the paper before I even had a pen in my hand. I was on it. Get it done. Ben, come in here, give me a heat pump, even though I didn't want one. So we went away on holiday a couple of weeks later, and he came round and installed it while we were away. Took him best part of a week, I think. Came back from holiday, sat down with him, and he gave us a handover. And I have to say, I was a bit jaded from driving home, and I wasn't that interested because, frankly, I wasn't going to use the air source heat pump. I knew it would be more expensive than the infrared. I knew enough about them to have worked that out, but I just wanted it there for when we sell the house. I knew I could take the infrared with me to the house we go to, so I was perfectly comfortable with all this. I wasn't too bothered. He told me all about it. We shook hands and he went away, and that was it. But he went away with it running, and I thought, actually, that's not a bad idea, because from what I do for a living, to have one house that's had the same two people in it through three completely different heating solutions is really good data. That's really valuable to me, because as you're probably starting to realise, I'm quite into some of this stuff. So this would have been really good data for me. So we ran it. Unfortunately, we're getting towards the latter end of the winter here. It was fired up for the first time on the 1st of March. So we're not hitting the really cold bit, but it was still winter, and we're still needing the heating on and so on. So we ran it. After a couple of weeks, I could check the electricity usage, and I could not believe what I saw. I could not believe it. Our electricity cost had dropped. Our electricity usage had dropped, principally at peak time. All of a sudden, this air source heat pump is outperforming our infrared system. Look at these figures here. So in 2025, our average per day cost for this same period in March, first 2 weeks in March, was £6.41. We're now hitting £3.49. It's almost half. Now, it's always difficult to make such a comparison on such a small data set, and there's nothing I can do about that until next year, and we can look at better data then. So what I've tried to do is to try and evaluate that small data set. The first thing is to pick up the solar on there. So you can see that in 2025 we had pretty much twice as much solar. So it was a lot more sun. It would have been warmer, okay? And I know it was warmer because 2025 March was the warmest March ever in recorded history. 2026 is the 10th warmest. So we should have been using more energy in 2026, and we would have been using more energy to heat the house than we were in 2025. And so it's still cheaper. The other things we need to take into account here is car charging. So how often did we charge the car in that 2-week period? Because just one car charge alone would make quite a big difference. And so to evaluate that, we need to look at the off-peak column. And you can see there's a lot more off-peak electricity used in 2025. So we obviously charge the car once or twice more than we did in 2026. But I've put a figure on that at the bottom. And so you can see the difference in cost was actually about £10 over the two. So, yes, the car charging has an impact on this, but you take that £10 out and we're still £73 against £45. So there's still a significant difference between the two. The reason I've only got 14 days of data is I then found out about and fully understood what was happening with daytime charging from Octopus Energy. Like I say, I hadn't found that bill that I showed you earlier, but I had an email from them telling me that things are changing because people were taking advantage of the daytime charging. What people were doing was they were winding back their EV chargers to charge slower so that they would have much longer periods at that cheap tariff. They basically were going to change the rules on this. And by this time, they had changed the rules. And what it was going to be was what we get is 6 hours car charging per day. at any time during the day, a total of 6 hours. That can be during the 6-hour cheap tariff at night, or it could be any other time. Now, if you do it during the 6 hours period at night, you're not getting on as much benefit as if you did it during the day, because obviously you plug in your charger and get the cheap tariff. You can run the house on that. You can do everything on that. And so your benefit is enormous from plugging it in during the day. So that's what I started doing. And that's what this chart is showing, is now our costs for the second half of March are coming in at £2.98 per day. So you can see, 50, 60p less per day than it was at the first half of March. And you can compare that with the same period the year before, 2025, where it was £8.39 per day. So another significant difference. So daytime charging is again saving us quite a lot of money. Now, in order to achieve all of this, the most important single thing in this equation is the EV, because the EV gives us the EV tariff, not just at night, but also during the day. So as far as driving down our costs are concerned, the EV becomes the most important single thing. The second most important thing is the battery, the domestic battery. So that enables you to buy at that cheap rate at night and use it during the day. Obviously get the sizing right and so on. The third most important thing for driving down our costs here is the air source heat pump, which has blown my mind as far as energy saving is concerned. In fact, my wife would tell you that after we had it installed and after I'd looked at that cost, I didn't sleep for 4 nights because I was trying to work out how the hell this was doing it. Because one of the interesting things is with the way the Heat Geeks set it up is they run it 24/7. The heating is on all day and all night, every day. You don't ever switch it off, is the theory. And I'm thinking, how can you have a heating system that's on 24/7 that costs less to run than my highly efficient infrared panels that were highly controllable, that we're only putting on at the very points we need them, in the very places we need them? How can we have that situation, especially knowing what I knew about air source heat pumps? And like I say, I spent 4 nights just trying to work it out until it eventually clicked. And what I realized was one of the most important parts of this is actually the limitations of the heating system that this is replacing or updating. And what I mean by that is our heating systems have been designed for rapid warm-up. They've been designed for rapid warm-up because typically we would heat first thing in the morning before we go to work, last thing at night when we come home. And when we switch on the heating, we want it to be up to temperature in the house within about half an hour, ideally. We want that sort of response. To get that sort of response, you have to oversize the heating system significantly. And we typically oversized by about 20%. Now, the system is already designed to deliver heat, to warm the house to 20 degrees C when it's -5 outside. So it's already oversized for 95% of the year, maybe longer. So it's oversized because of that design criteria, and then we oversize it again in order to get rapid heat up. Now, the other thing we do is we run at a flow temperature of 60 degrees. Why? Our hot water comes out of the tank at a temperature that we have to mix cold water with it in order to use it. Why are we heating to 60 degrees? Do the radiators need 60 degrees to get the room up to 20 degrees? Well, obviously it's helpful with rapid warm-up, but other than that, it isn't. They are oversized and the temperature is higher than it needs to be. When we do this, we run it at 60 degrees because of the hot water cylinder. And the hot water cylinder is storing water. And as such, it is susceptible to Legionnaire's disease or growing Legionella, which forms Legionnaire's disease. And so to overcome that, it has to be heated to over 55 degrees C to prevent the growth of Legionella and other bacteria. But the rate of development of those is such that you don't actually need to do it all the time. You can heat to that level once a month. Now, I was already doing this, to be honest, with my old system. I was already running my domestic hot water at 45 degrees, and once a week I would do a Legionella run, as they call it, and bang it up to 60 degrees, normally overnight on a Sunday. But if your heating system is doing that, is basically running at a 60-degree flow temperature, it is going to be massively inefficient. It's going to be inefficient because the boiler will be short cycling all the time, be firing up for a minute or two, cutting out. Firing up for a minute or two, cutting out. That wastes an awful lot of fuel. Now, what the heat geeks are doing is they're saying, let's run it all the time. Ben said to me when he did the handover, he showed me on the screen, he showed me a graph. And this graph showed the outside air temperature and the flow temperature of the boiler. Basically, what it was showing was what the flow temperature would be when it was minus 20 outside, what the flow temperature would be when it's minus 10 outside, what the flow temperature would be when it's 0, plus 10, plus 20. And the graph followed those points. And what they do is they tell you to grab hold of that graph, because you can dynamically change it, and pull it down. Pull it down a step at a time, a degree at a time, every day, until you hit a day when the heating doesn't adequately heat the house. It's too cold. And then push it up one. And at that point, you have exactly matched the heat coming out from the air source heat pump into your system with the heat losses of your building. You have hit perfect parity with the thermal performance of your building. You have got an amazingly optimized system. So the driver of the system is actually an external temperature sensor, which registers the external temperature and controls the flow temperature based on that to optimize it. So instead of using a room stat to drive the whole system, and they still have a room stat, it is really driven, or the economy is driven, by an external temperature sensor. And this, in my opinion, is truly brilliant. And the last thing is the solar array. The solar array still has a purpose, but instead of being the headline that most people aspire to or do, to say the solar array drives everything, it is actually pretty much the least important thing here. Serves a great purpose through the summer, gives us free electricity in the summer. In fact, we make money out of it in the summer because we can sell the excess back to our provider. So the solar array still has a purpose, but it is not as important, in my opinion, as the domestic battery, and the EV is the most important thing of all. I think the solar array and the air source heat pump can swap places. They're there or thereabouts. But that's the system as far as I am concerned. However, wouldn't it be lovely if, while we've got the car plugged in and charging, we could also charge the house battery? And I thought this shouldn't be difficult to do. I thought I might even be able to write something myself that would do this, because we've got an API that enables us to hook into Octopus. We've got an API that enables me to hook into my battery system. So I started investigating. But while I was looking, I came across this website, WonderWatt. And it just does that. Basically, it hooks into the Octopus Intelligent Go tariff. And every time you're down at the charge rate for your EV, it enables you to do things on your system. And the thing I wanted to do on my system was charge my domestic battery. Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. So now we can charge the battery during the day. And so that problem of it running out partway through the day is probably completely overcome. Let's look at how this looks on a typical January day. So what will happen is from midnight through to 5:30, we'll be charging at our 6p tariff. From there until somewhere around about midday, our electricity is coming off the battery, so it's free. And then we plug the car in, or the car picks up and starts charging after lunch. So I've got 4 hours of charging here at 6p. So it's charging the car, charging the battery, and then from about 4 or 5 o'clock onwards, the electricity is free again until we start the process off again at 11:30 at night for the next day. Now you can see on the line below that, I've got state of charge of my domestic battery. So at the end of the nighttime period, it will be at 12 kilowatts. By the time it's been discharging for that period of time, it's likely to be around about 2 kilowatts. That's based on my typical daily usage, which is 1.3 kilowatt hours per hour. So we'll be down to 2 kilowatts at that time. Then after the charge period during the afternoon, we'll be up to 12 kilowatts again, and then it will be back down to 3.3 at the end of that next process. That looks like a cost of 80p a day in January. Now, that's not going to happen, okay? What we're saying there is not going to happen. And that's not going to be happening because I've got a 5 kilowatt inverter, okay? So there will be times in the day where the demand on our system is greater than 5 kilowatts. And so at those points, we'll be buying electricity at full rate. So it's not quite on it, but it's not far off. Now, if we look at this bill, this gives a really good representation of it. So this is in April, unfortunately, but it's going to be similar. So if we look at this, overnight, we charge the domestic battery at 6p. In fact, at this point, it was 4.95p. April 2026, the rates went down, and 26.5p for our high P. And then you can see around lunchtime, surprisingly, we get the cheap electricity at this time, and we charge the car, and we also charge the domestic battery. So you can see for the rest of the day, there's no electricity being used. Well, I lied. There's a tiny, tiny bit. If you look closely at that line, it's a slightly thickened line because there's a little bit of electricity being used. You can see that on the numbers there, the consumption, but it's tiny, absolutely tiny. So for that day, our cost was £1.13. So it is more than the 80p I was predicting, but it's not going to be a lot more than that. So by charging the car, charging the domestic battery using Wonderwatt, we get some incredible looking costs for very little money. You pay a little bit of money for Wonderwatt. I think you pay them £4 a month, something like that, but you'll easily recover that, especially in winter. Now, there's a few other little things you can do here to help save a little bit of money. First thing I've done, or one of the things I've done, is I've put all the things that need charging, so things like your phones, your laptops, cameras, we've got an electric lawnmower, I've got a big battery in my surveying equipment and things like that. Put those all on a charging panel like this, where all those things are plugged in, and switch it between 11:30 and 5:30 in the morning. I use a smart switch, a Wi-Fi enabled switch, and that way you're only charging at cheaper rate. Now this is tiny, none of these things take a lot of electricity, but it all helps. Another thing that I think is slightly more significant than that is a portable battery. Now these are becoming really popular for plug-in solar, but if you've, say, like me, work from home, you could put one of these in your home office, whether that home office is out in the garden or like me, it's inside the house. Put one of these in and run the whole office off it. Charge it overnight at the cheap rate and then run the office during the day. It also acts as a protected power supply. So if there's a power cut, you carry on working. And the other nice thing with these is if you're a camper, you can take them away on holiday with you and use them while you're camping. So I think that's a really cool idea. So it's effectively giving you a second battery that's taking some of the load from a specific place in your building. I'm saying home office. It could be anywhere that sort of fits that profile, your workshop in the garage or something like that. Anything could fit that profile. Now there's more to this. And the next thing is a company called Axel Energy. And this is really interesting. And I think we're going to see a lot more of this going forward. So the grid is coming to terms with a changing world. When I say the grid, I think that the grid as a general thing. So historically, the grid had a number of relatively small inputs into the grid from coal and gas and nuclear, and a bit of wet stuff as well, a bit of dams on lakes. So there was, relatively few inputs into the grid as far as electricity generation was concerned, and all the electricity went in one direction. It went into our houses. Now, what's changed is now we've got electricity being generated in multiple places all around the country. So we've got two directional electricity going to the grid. Now and that can create problems, especially with the solar on the roofs. So what Axel are doing is saying, if you've got a battery at home, and we've got a little bit of a problem that we need to sort out on the grid, or if the grid's got a bit of a problem, we will buy your electricity from your battery and sell it to your neighbours. And they're buying it at £1 a kilowatt hour. I'm paying 6p a kilowatt hour at most for it. So it's massively profitable. And as a bare minimum, they'll give you £10 a month anyway. £10 a month, even without you selling them any electricity. That's £120 a year off your electric bill, which is already coming down dramatically. This is really useful. But now Octopus have got on board. And Octopus are in the process of introducing, by the time you read this or listen to this, it probably is in place, what they call the charge pack. And that is doing everything that Axel are talking about with Axel Energies buying your battery power, but also what Wonderwatt are doing as far as enabling you to charge during the day. So this is really good. And they're paying a little bit more than Axel Energy. So £12 a month, £144 a year. Another thing worth considering is the Homely smart controller for air source heat pumps. Now, the guys at Heat Geeks are looking at this at the moment and will probably be introducing it. What the Homely system does is it looks at likely tariff is going to be for the next half hour and heats your house accordingly. So in other words, if you've got cheaper electricity coming in, at the time you get the cheaper electricity, it'll put a bit more heat into the house. And then where it's more expensive, it'll put a little less and use the fabric of the house to balance that. So you're just saving a bit of money by using a really smart heating controller. Really cool. So this is where we are cost-wise. So if we now take into account things like Axel, I think our predicted annual costs are going to come down to about 868. And this is based on those revised figures as far as our annual costs and our daily costs are likely to be. So again, we would have been at 6,400, we're now at 868. So the question is, what did it cost to do all this? Well, the EV is virtually free, and this is, for me, it's virtually free. Because I'm self-employed, I've only got to do a certain amount of mileage for business, and the difference in what it costs to run and what we claim against tax means that the cost of the car is paid for. The running costs of the petrol vary between nothing and 1.5p a mile, so it's virtually free. It also saves us so much money on the house that it could actually be cost positive, in other words, or at least cost negative. In other words, we might even be making a profit out of the EV. So putting in the domestic battery was 4,600, the solar array was 5,300. Both of these have got cheaper since we did ours, quite a lot cheaper. The air source heat pump, by the time we paid the consultation fee, was 1,450. So £11,405 total. And if you look at how much we're saving per month, if you put that on a loan over 24 months, that would cost you nothing. In other words, if you were paying out £465.78 per month for 24 months to pay for that system, at the end of it, you've got an unbelievably cheap heating system, an energy system, and it's cost you nothing to get there because you paid for it over a 24-month period at a rate that matched the money you were saving. And it isn't quite what we did. We didn't bother with a loan, but that's pretty much what we did. There's more ways of saving. If you've got a mortgage, Lloyds, Halifax, HSBC are offering money towards these technologies to help you save money. Nationwide are offering you a £20,000 interest-free loan to do any of these technologies. And the Wiltshire Switch Together scheme is the one that I use for the solar and the battery, where what happens is Wiltshire Council get 600 people together that want a solar system and then go out and find someone to price 600 installs. So you really do get the price driven down quite a lot. I think we saved about a third on what it would have been if we'd gone to anyone else. So more savings. Now, having said all that, there's a massive, massive shift coming. And that is called bidirectional EV charging. So what do we mean by this? Well, it means that your charger for your car, and your car not only can charge, but it can also discharge back into the house or to the grid. Now, if you take it as vehicle to house, or V to H as they call it, we can use the car to do everything I've just been talking about. Now, the way I picture this is to say, have your normal EV, your normal day-to-day EV, and then get a second-hand, much cheaper one. Something like the Nissan Leaf. And the Nissan Leaf can be picked up for really good value, anything from a couple of thousand to 4,000 or 5,000. Less money typically than you would pay for a domestic battery. My battery was £4,500. A Nissan Leaf with a 24 kilowatt hour battery in it, twice the size of mine, I can pick up for about £2,000, half the price. Okay, so you're getting twice as much battery for half the price. If I get a 48 kilowatt hour one, I'll probably pay a £4,000 or £5,000 for it. That's an awesome battery, absolutely awesome battery. Get one of those, stick it on the drive, run the house from it. Simple. Makes it even easier to take the battery when you move. You can drive it to your new house. But not only that, you do have a second vehicle that you can use when you need a second vehicle. So it's got value as a vehicle, an immense value for the house. And if you take everything I've said and apply it to a car that's parked on your drive, I think you will save yourself an enormous amount of money. Now, I'm apologising now because I think this is going to push the second-hand value of Nissan Leafs up enormously. And I say Nissan Leafs because with bidirectional charging, not all EVs will support bidirectional charging. So the Japanese EV charging standard is called CHAdeMO, which isn't very popular in the rest of the world, but it is bidirectional. So any Japanese EV is likely to support bidirectional charging. The very first Nissan Leafs didn't, so you need to be careful with this. So it's only the later ones that did. So just make sure you get the right one. Some Kias do. I think most Polestars do. No Teslas do. And I'm not surprised because Tesla would stand to lose an awful lot if they bidirectionally charge because they make a lot of money out of their domestic batteries. So if you're going to take this route, be very careful that you get the right car and the right charger. And there are bidirectional chargers that are on the market now. So Sig Energy and Zappi both have bidirectional chargers on the market. So you can buy the charger. You won't be able to use it bidirectionally until the government has sorted out the legals and it's wired in appropriately. But this is massive. That's all I've got to say, would you believe? We've reached the end. I hope you found that useful. It's been an interesting journey for us. We've really enjoyed it. We're only doing this to help other people get benefit out of this. So I hope that's of value to you. We've got no allegiances to any of the companies we've mentioned. As I've said with those that I have mentioned, they're great companies, but we've got no financial connection whatsoever. So this is just our experience. Go out and talk to them and see how you get on. Good luck. Thank you very much.